Welcome guys, dito tayo talagang Ilustrado vibes tayo dito sa Manila House. Marami tayong pag-usapan today. So I'm gonna do my mini lecture discussion, the age of disruption. I'm gonna talk about artificial intelligence, populism, new Cold War, and the big three. BRICS, BYD, and BTS. Essentially, changes in the physics of power, influence, and knowledge and innovation as far as the 21st century is concerned. So abangan yan. I'm sure you're gonna appreciate it. Sana.
Richard?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bambina. It's a pleasure to finally see in person. Am I gonna be like an Aladdin sit down here, or like, okay, I can squeeze? Okay, yeah, fantastic. Squeeze myself in here. All right, we're reaching the golden hour, so I think that should be a good lighting for our vlogger part of this conversation today. I was really looking forward to a very big picture analysis today, and not to discuss domestic politics as much as possible. And next thing I know, finally, the impeachment happened. And when you say impeachment, meaning it has been transmitted from the lower house to the upper house. So it's a long conversation what's going to happen in the Senate. As I've been saying, I don't think it would have been transmitted to the Senate if there were not enough confidence that the Senate will not shut it down. Because as you know the rule, if it's terminated, then you have to file after a year, and that's a completely different conversation once it comes to 2026. So let's see how Senate's gonna approach it. So going back to today, I really wanted to do big picture analysis, and accordingly, we're gonna look at least three major themes. Now, this is ambitious, probably it's a book project in the making, right? These are themes that I've been discussing throughout the years. If you check some of the lectures and book talks I gave at Stanford University throughout the years, you would see that I mentioned some of these issues, this interaction of climate change, artificial intelligence, and really the shifting locus and at the same time shifting physics of power in the 21st century. There's a PowerPoint, right? And isn't there a PowerPoint? Oh yeah, here you go. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so again, very quickly, we'll discuss, there are actually basically three B's I want to discuss today, like BRICS, right? BYD, and BTS, right? And I think that kind of sets the tone for our conversation today. Now, 2 years ago, around this time, I got a very interesting email, a request to have a sit down with Henry Kissinger. He was about to get 100 years old, and I was wondering, it's like, is he okay? Like how? And apparently, he was looking at around 4 or 5 big thinkers in Asia from different regions of the Indo-Pacific region. And eventually, we had that conversation. And I was really wondering, what is he going to ask about? Is it about US and China, etc.? Obviously, much of the discussion was confidential. But to the degree that I can share about it, what Henry Kissinger did was immediately said, what do you think are going to be, like in that Henry Kissinger way, going to be the biggest challenges of the 21st century, right? And immediately all of us so we were prepared to talk about, military issues, South China Sea, ASEAN. So immediately the conversation went in very, very big picture direction. One was, of course, about the implication of rise of China. And as a former Singaporean Prime Minister said, the rise of China is not going to be about a new balance of power. It's going to be a new order altogether, because China is just so big. It's not another just rising power. So Kissinger came from a very similar point of view. But if you bother to actually follow Henry Kissinger's works throughout the years, he not only focused on the issue of China, but he had a couple of very influential interventions on artificial intelligence. A former professor of mine used to have a conspiracy theory that Kissinger was not really writing them, and that these were just ghost written by his co-authors and all. But that 3-hour conversation we had with him made it very clear to me that, he was very alert. And actually, after the first hour of opening, he came up with his synthesis in a very Kissingerian sense. And I noticed with him, at the age of 99, you could perfectly transcribe him, and there's no grammatical error whatsoever. He speaks perfectly for transcription. And the joke about Kissinger used to be, do you have any questions for my answers, right? And in many ways, that has been my also motto. And we'll have more of that later in the question and answer portion. So we already had arguably the most influential, I won't say greatest, because obviously Kissinger is extremely controversial. His role in the Indochina Wars, his role in the Middle East conflict, Chile, Salvador Allende. I don't want to piss off my friends down in Santiago. But the fact of the matter is that you cannot argue that he was arguably the most influential statesman of the 20th century, or one of the most. In fact, some people say that the past century was not only an American century, it was a Kissinger century. So if someone like Henry Kissinger in the opening decades and in the opening decades of the 21st century and in the twilight months of his year was thinking about this big question, maybe he was up to something. And I think that is why I felt for a younger generation, people like us, we have to really pay serious attention to some of these major trends that we're seeing in every major phase of collective and political interaction. You know, I can cite you 1,000 different books, but few of the most influential books in terms of shaping my ideas on these big questions that Henry Kissinger asked us 2 years ago. One of them was, really I suggest this is Franco Fukuyama's 2-volume book, not The End of History, not necessarily my favorite, Political Order and Political Decay and Origins of Political Order. It's an absolutely amazing survey of how China's modern state was established, India's modern state was established, how American democracy is established, and more importantly, how institutions decay over time. So if you read those books, you would have been not surprised at all with the kind of democratic crisis and populism we're seeing nowadays. The other very influential book was by Moises Naim, the founder and the first editor of Foreign Policy magazine, together with Samuel Huntington. There is a reason why I didn't put Samuel Huntington there. Clash of Civilization, not a fan of that. But this is a very interesting book. If you read about it, what it's saying is that because of the quantitative expansion in number of countries and population, it will have a qualitative effect in terms of our politics, in terms of technological innovation. When you go from 1 billion people to 7 billion people, it creates all sorts of possibilities that were not there before, including, and this is what we're going to discuss today, the rise of disruptors. And in this book, it's fascinating. He talks about disruptor political parties, small political parties that go from fringe, and then next thing you know, they're the second most powerful party in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. It could go from MAGA Tea Party, and next thing you know, the guy has a second term in office in the White House and the 47th president. These were the issues that were almost predicted by his book 2 decades ago. He also looks at the rise of disruptor powers. You see, you don't need to be a superpower anymore for you to have a lot of global influence. As we speak today, one of the most important conflicts in the world are being mediated by not so big countries. Qatar, for instance, is playing a very influential role in the direction of the negotiations of not only ceasefire, but the day after, meaning reconstruction of Gaza and what's going to happen there. So these were the things that were mentioned in this book 20 years ago. And in fact, Moises Naim is the guy who coined the term mini-lateralism. This is not about bilateral, multilateral, but the world will increasingly be shaped by interaction among few like-minded countries in a very tactical, ad hoc, and issue-specific ways. So if you look at the rise of the Quad, the rise of AUKUS, the rise of what I call JAFUS, Japan, Philippines, US, again, these things were almost predicted by Moises Naim 20 years ago. So I really suggest check some of these books. The other book that is really my favorite, among my favorites, again, An Economist of Turkish Origin, Dani Rodrik, One Economics, Many Recipes. It's a fantastic book about how different countries were able to climb up the ladder of development through a very diverse and heterodox set of policies. That the so-called Washington Consensus or the Beijing Consensus, whatever you want to call it, if you look at it, the successful countries were the countries that were able to come up with the best ingredients of policies to push themselves to the next level. In short, many things were taught in schools of economics or public policy, unfortunately, are not keeping up with the granular complexities of public policy on the ground. And the more innovative and unorthodox you are, the higher chance of success, especially in our era of deglobalization and disruption. Now, As I promised, I'm going to talk about 3 Bs: BRICS, BYD, and BTS. Each of them are standing for a major change in the physics of power and the trend lines that we're seeing. First, let's talk about BRICS, my favorite. Now, if you look at the BRICS countries, so you see the member states on the side. As we speak, the membership is expanding. Indonesia had a volte-face because under former President Jokowi, Indonesia said, we don't want to join that BRICS thing as a little bit too Russia, China, axis power-ish. We want to go for OECD. And then Prabowo comes in and says, nah, we want to be part of BRICS. We're a big power, big country, we want to be there. And that tells you something about why countries want to join BRICS. It's not necessarily because BRICS is effective as an organization. There's much more involved there. But if you look at the BRICS in terms of their purchasing power parity share of global GDP and increasingly nominal share of the global GDP, they're no longer as irrelevant or marginal as they used to be. Ironically, the BRICS is obviously a brainchild of Wall Street, friends at the Goldman Sachs. The Goldman Sachs guys folded already the BRICS portfolio, but the BRICS itself has now a life of its own. It's kind of like Bitcoin. Even if it doesn't have any foundation, if you believe in it, it's going to create its own reality and momentum. So if you look at the BRICS, and I had a piece on this just a few weeks ago before I went for a conference at ASEAN in Kuala Lumpur. If you look at the BRICS, yes, the organization itself is just north of pathetic, right? It's kind of like ASEAN, right? It's like, Hopi, changey diversity. But in terms of the actual investments that BRICS Bank and BRICS-related institutions are making, it's nowhere close to either World Bank or Belt and Road Initiative or some of the bilateral deals that some of these countries are making. So it's still at the level of symbolic posturing. Having said that, in my opinion, there's a reason why Donald Trump keeps on tweeting about BRICS. Because I think many in Washington, D.C., if you talk to think tanks there, they see BRICS as something potentially dangerous down the road because it represents some fundamental shift, right? The first thing you have to keep in mind is that many countries want to join the BRICS because they see prestige and also signaling of their dissatisfaction with the existing international order. Look at the policies of the United States in the Middle East over the past 2 or 3 decades. Look at what the United States has been saying about International Court of Justice or ICC. Look at what Trump has been doing with Greenland and Panama and 21st century Monroe Doctrine. It's hard to sustain the argument that the West is the harbinger or anchor of a rules-based international order. So BRICS, despite its problematic membership, we can talk about a couple of countries there, including one which just invaded Ukraine the other year. Yes, we can talk about that, but the reality is that I think as the West's moral capital or pretension to moral capital disintegrates, the element of prestige of BRICS dramatically increases. It's destigmatized. In fact, Putin used the BRICS summit last year to very much say, Russia is back, forget about isolating us. All the big boys are here, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres. But the second thing is that there's also actual element of hedging. As you know, some of the countries who want to join the BRICS, like Vietnam, have very robust defense relationship with Russia. In fact, there was a New York Times report by our good friend there, Hannah, just the other year, that while Biden was visiting Vietnam, the Vietnamese were secretly negotiating a $6 to $8 billion new defense agreement with Russia. The problem for the Vietnamese is that they want to diversify, but a lot of their elites in the intelligence and security community are trained in Cyrillic and trained in Russia. In fact, if you're familiar with VinFast, the guy behind the VinFast car used to sell noodles in Ukraine and used to study in Russia. So they have a very Russia-influenced Cyrillic kind of technology-driven military. Their most advanced weapon systems, their MiG fighters, their 6-kilo class submarines, all come from Russia. It's kind of similar to the problem of Indians who want to also diversify from Russia, but it's actually a bit more stark. Because as you know also, Vietnam is not necessarily a quad country, right? It still has complicated relationship with the United States. And there's so many other layers that I don't have time to talk about, but in the future you can buy my book. There's a whole chapter on Vietnam where I explain that. But there are also other countries like Malaysia. As you know, Malaysia has played a very important role, for instance, in allowing countries like Iran and Russia to bypass sanctions by the West, right, in terms of export of oil. So a lot of oil that goes from Iran to China passes through Malaysia. It's rebranded as Malaysians. So if you are a couple of rising countries, emerging powers, including Southeast Asia, it makes sense to be part of the BRICS so that you can better coordinate some of your attempts to circumvent international sanction, Western sanctions, that you believe have no moral, ethical basis. Like, oh, you want to talk about Ukraine conflict? Let's talk about Gaza conflict. You want to talk about 1,000 kids killed in this area? Let's talk about the 30,000 children allegedly killed there. So that logic, that discourse, gives also this kind of almost a moral impetus that you have to engage more the BRICS, right? In terms of hedging. But lastly, it's also about diversification. I mean, honestly, I don't even know Trump knows what Trump wants, but it's not very unreasonable to expect that in 2 or 3 years from now, the US and the US dollar will not be the most attractive thing on earth, right? I mean, at the rate things are going, probably the Trump meme coins will be more worth than US dollars. Or anyway, it's and if Trump goes with his fiscal policies, right? Reduce taxes on the richest people and then cut the expenditures, they're going to be in quite a tricky situation. And some of the serious economists there have made some calculations that the U.S. economic position could be severely affected if some of the worst versions of Trump's policies move forward. We can talk about Trump a little bit more later on, but one of my latest favorite discoveries was that way more than Andrew Jackson, the real idol of Donald Trump is McKinley. So the Filipino connection is there. And McKinley was the man who believed in fiscal discipline, right? That's the way to be macho, right? To tighten your belt, and imperial power and frontiers, including the colonization of this country, which our American friends rarely mention. They always talk about friends, allies, partners. Yeah, former colonies. You want to add that to our conversation. So there are actually many reasons. I was just in New Delhi last month, and we had an event with, it was a Japan-India bilateral dialogue, and we had S. Shankar, among others, saying that, oh no, we don't want to do anything with this what do you call it, this BRICS currency, whatever. True, that's true. I don't think anyone is excited about a currency which is even more questionable than Bitcoin at this point in time. But having said that, last time I checked, Russia is already conducting 90% of its oil trade with countries like India or China in their own currencies, right? So it's completely de-dollarized. And Russia's trades are with these two giants is in hundreds of billions of dollars. That's no joke. And just a week after I left New Delhi, there was I think Reliance folks signed a deal with the Russians. It's a 10-year deal for, essentially our Indian friends will buy the Russian stuff, refine it, resell it to Europe, make money, everyone happy. So actually, I've seen a lot of memes whereby like Europe is crying and then the Russians are like, anyway, that's the world we live in. It's really a mess, right? But it's a mess that benefits people who are smart and know how to work around it. So in short, I think it's unfair to say BRICS is just a joke. It is more than a joke, and it will be much more serious down the road. If you talk to people who are experts in psychology and human relationship, they say the person you want to date is not the person who's great now, but the person who has a potential to be great in the future. That's the kind of person you want to invest in. Well, what? BRICS kind of represents that. It's not what it is today as a hollow organization, but what it represents and what it could bring about down the road. As we see, the Iranians and Russians are also creating their own alternatives to the SWIFT. As you know, SWIFT is what we use when we do internet. They have their own integration of their financial systems, and down the road, more and more countries are going to come in. This year's BRICS is going to be hosted by Lula, our friend in Brazil, who is a big fan of China and a big apologist of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to be honest. I love the guy, but that just tells you that things are going to get more interesting. And if you are looking at South Africa, the other big member of the BRICS, they just got or about to get sanctioned by the US because Elon Musk whispered into Trump's ears that the white people down there are being oppressed or something along those lines. In short, everything is coming together. All the stars are aligning for BRICS to be something more substantial and something more important. And that's why Indonesia, which officially became the 7th or 8th largest GDP by PPP number and top 20 already, joined excitingly this organization, which on the record still has not much to offer, but it's about what it can offer in the future. But let's be honest, the story of BRICS is really the story of China. And the story of China is the greatest story of our era in every sense of the word. Negative, positive, neutral, the whole spectrum of it. Just putting value judgment aside, the numbers speak for themselves. Look at the massive expansion in China's share of global manufacturing in the past 20 years. Now, 1/3 of everything that is produced on Earth is produced by one country alone, China. That's tremendous amount of concentration of manufacturing power. And if you look at China's weight of global GDP, in 1992, China's GDP was smaller than Italy. No offense to Italy. They're amazing people, great food and all. Now, in PPP terms, it's already 20 to 30%, I think, bigger than the US. And nominal terms, not reached there yet, but in terms of share of global GDP, it's closer to 20%, which is a very healthy number. But let's never forget, by historical standards, China is just reassuming the position it used to occupy for much of human history. Again, I think a lot of us have this bias for the present era, but you also have to look at the lingerie. China is just going back to what it was, which was the main manufacturer on Earth, right? That's what China was. The only thing I don't like about the Chinese narrative is they talk as if China is the only thing. Now, back in the day, India was a great civilization. The Ottomans were a great civilization. It was not Silk Road. It was many roads and many products. But having said that, give credit where credit is due. And China is, this is, I would call it a Chinese economic renaissance. I think renaissance is the best way to put it because they're going back to that historical greatness. Except they're using very modern Western capitalist modes of production to achieve that. Now, with economic rise comes geopolitical tensions. It's inevitable. The more you have technological capacity, the more you have economic resources, the more you're going to scare the hell out of your rivals. And that's why our good friends in Harvard have been talking about the so-called Thucydides trap, referring to the case between Sparta and Athens, whereby for hundreds of years, Sparta was the OG of the Athenian world. Spartans were the ones who beat the Persians during the Second Persian invasion under Xerxes. But suddenly, after the defeat of the Persians, the Athenians began to build their own little Delian League empire. And that began to completely change the balance of power within the Greek world. And the Spartans were not happy about that. Next thing you know, there was a civil war within the Greek world, and that was the Peloponnesian War. The one man who really paid good attention to make sense out of this war, which by the way involved Socrates. Socrates was one of the warriors there. At the age of 35 to 40, was still fighting the war. Very brave man. Thucydides said that war just shows you that at the end of the day, when it comes to nations or politics, it's not about ethics, it's not about morality, it's about balance of power. And when balance of power, in the opinion of the rising power and the status quo power, is not something favorable, then you're heading towards a very, very dangerous situation. Why? Because the status quo power, aka US, is not feeling very comfortable. You don't have to listen to the Senate hearing confirmation of, not Hackseth, but Rubio or some of these other people about how they're worried about China. In fact, both Democrats and the Republicans are consistent about it. China is the pacing threat. Is the kind of rival to the US that no one ever was, including the Soviets. This is a completely different game. At the same time, if you are China, you feel entitled to more voice in the international system. If the Americans can go around and bully Panama and Greenland and all, why can't we get back Taiwan, whichever way we want? Why can't we control 85% of our immediate waters? If the Americans had the Monroe Doctrine for 2 centuries and Trump is updating that, why can't we have our own baby Monroe Doctrine in our part of the world? Let's just call it 9-line, 11-line, or what have you. Or I think they have a nicer term, a community of harmony and cooperation and all of that. Our Japanese friends used to have something for that. It didn't work very well. East Asia Co-Prosperity Zone, whatever, okay. But the Asia for Asians keeps on coming up in every major event China hosts. Every time you attend a major event China, they keep on saying, at the end of the day, we're all Asians, right? This is a conversation among us. And when my Japanese friend said, actually, they got a point, I kind of got worried. Maybe this is working, because the Chinese are very, very generous when they host you. I'm not saying I'm jealous of those vlogger friends of ours who didn't show up in the hearing yesterday, but when China hosts you, they really roll out the red carpet, even if you're a nobody. No offense to Brussels, but I think the best I got was a decent coffee whenever I visited the European Union. And I don't want to even talk about the State Department and all, right? So China has a way of really impressing everyone and saying Asia for Asians, right? And my joke with Xi Jinping is Mao with the money. He has the Mao Zedong kind of a sense of greatness, but he got the money too. But we'll talk about more than money. The conversation today is what the heck is going on? Is it a Cold War? Is it a new Cold War? Is it great power? What the heck is this? And the greatest mind on earth, including people who have been experts on the original Cold War, cannot agree with each other. So for instance, people like former ambassador and current Stanford professor Michael Mackfall, their argument is absolutely clear. Xi Jinping is not Stalin. And as I tell my Chinese friends who are not very happy with what Xi Jinping is doing, it's like, but he's not Putin too, right? China is a very different civilization. It's a very different statecraft, right? I have stories from my grandfather and my dad's side who were occupied by the Soviets in some area, godforsaken places in Kashmir. Soviet Russian people are really, like you can ask the Ukrainians about it. China is far more subtle. It's a far more subtle and far more long-term thinking, right? They're not going to get you tomorrow, and they're willing to wait for another 1,000 years if it's necessary. Maybe not literally, obviously a lot of that is exaggeration and poetics, but it's a different strategic culture and a different statecraft. There was no Russia 700 years ago, right? There was Golden Horde, but there was a China for thousands of years in terms of their statecraft and in terms of their strategic culture. So some of them, these people are saying, it doesn't even make sense for us to compare this because Russia is different from China. And by the way, Stalin was Georgian. He was not even, his original name was actually, and then there are other people like Stephen Kotkin, absolutely great guy when it comes to his writing on Russia. I suggest look at his book, 2-volume book, 3-volume almost book on Stalin, based on archived evidence. And one of the greatest things he discovered in his archival studies in Russia was that actually communists believed in communism. So he got transcripts of debates within the Politburo where they were literally debating about historical materialism and dialectics. Literally, Stalin will say, comrade, but according to Hegel, at this moment of historical, like literally that was the transcript. So the most amazing discovery he made was that the communists were actually communists. And they were a failure, a big failure. Many would say the reason why Gorbachev did what Gorbachev did is because one day he just went to his office and said, I cannot say it in Russian, but something along the lines, this is not the way to live, right? Everything is falling apart. Everyone's pretending to work. Everyone's pretending to be paid. It was a system falling apart, and then Chernobyl happened, right? If you would watch the Chernobyl HBO series, you'll get an idea. And if you read Alexei Navalny's new biography that came out, his family actually comes from that region, from his Ukrainian side. He'll tell you what a scary mess was the Soviet Union in the 1980s. For Kotkin, what we're seeing right now is not a new Cold War, is a new chapter in this great power rivalry by essentially ex-empires who never accepted their defeat by the West. Look at all the 3 major powers who are challenging the West today. Russians, the Chinese, and the Persians. All 3 of them were Eurasian land powers. And all of them had their moments in the sun, some of them for thousands of years, especially Persians and the Chinese. Look at all these 3 countries today. It's just not in their DNA to accept a secondary position with an international order. And all of them have a hard time accepting how these Western people, maritime powers, were able to dominate the world. Actually, if you look at all these 3 countries, they have massive land armies. But China is the one that is building up its navy, and slowly Iranians and Russians. So, from Kotkin's point of view, what we're seeing right now is actually the former powers never giving up on the idea and trying to reclaim their historical glory in different languages. Putin has his own version, Tehran has his own version, and Zhongnanhai has his own version. So for him, the Cold War actually never ended. In fact, when the Cold War effectively ended, there was a certain KGB official positioned not too far away from Berlin Wall, and he was pissed off like hell, right? And that guy is named Vladimir Putin, who speaks impeccable German. Just go to YouTube and check his speech before the German Bundestag. He speaks perfect German, right? With a little bit of Eastern German accent. But that guy never accepted it. And Putin said over and over again, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'll tell you what, the progressive in me agrees with him in a very different sense of the word. Soviet Union kept the West honest. The reason why Scandinavia developed welfare state, The reason why you had New Deal and all of these things was because they were scared if they didn't do that, communist parties would rise to power in the West. So actually, to keep communism at bay, they had to develop welfare states. But once the Soviet Union was gone, neoliberalism comes in, market reforms come in, but China is now changing the game altogether. There's a third perspective, and I think this is so Adam Tooze actually is a gentleman. We follow each other on Twitter. He's a really smart guy. He has a Substack which is free. He teaches at Columbia University and has a podcast with Foreign Policy Magazine. Really, really smart guy. I suggest you guys check him out. His argument essentially is the one between Soviet Union and US, that was just the entree. This is the real one. Because the Soviet Union, even at its peak, was only 60% of the GDP of US. Forget about Japan, Europe, and all. China is a different ballgame altogether, not to mention 1.3 billion people. Even if China's population shrinks, worst case scenario, there'll be 700 million people in 50 years from now. So what? By that time, their GDP per capita is probably $40,000 in a very, very advanced country. Now, and then there are other people saying that we are moving from an era of chimerica, meaning mutual financial intercourse, to an era of cold peace. In short, it's still a debate ongoing. What is not being debated is that in Washington, there is a consensus that something has to be done about the rise of China, because China has completely erased the distinction between geoeconomics and geopolitics. You can no longer say this is just an economic issue, this is just a geopolitical issue. That is why during the 30 days I kept on saying, don't say this is a private Chinese company. There's no such thing as purely private Chinese company. When a Chinese company invests in your country, if they get a call from Zhongnanhai, they'll have to follow it through. Whether you're ByteDance, whether you're Huawei, well, I don't know where's Jack Ma. Is he still teaching in Tokyo University? You get the story, right? So first in the West, there was this illusion that you could decouple from China, meaning you cut them out. You try to isolate them like Iran and Russia, and it will work until they realize, wait, China is too big to isolate. It's just so big. In fact, China is one of the biggest sources of economic growth, globally speaking. And it's the biggest trading partner of more countries than America. And that number is just going to increase. So what can you do? Jake Sullivan, after Hillary Clinton lost, because he was supposed to be probably Secretary of State or something if Hillary Clinton had won, he realized like, okay, something is going on. So he did deep thinking and all. And the idea came up is de-risking. And what is de-risking? You cannot decouple from China, but there could be some special sectors that you can keep China out of it, right? Small yard, high fence. So one of the areas they identified, for instance, is semiconductors. I was at The Hague last year around September, October, and I was trying to figure out my train from Amsterdam to The Hague. And a gentleman came to me and all, and apparently he was from China, and asked, oh, what are you doing? I'm studying electrical engineering. Oh, we're studying. And he said, I'm not allowed in certain laboratories in Netherlands. Because, as you know, Netherlands has a monopoly on that lithography, the ability to do very micro level, right? Tattooing essentially of the semiconductors that allows them to operate at such high level. So that's part of the risking. So what the US has been doing over the past few years is essentially bully allies from Japan to Korea and Netherlands, among others, to keep China out, including Chinese students, Chinese citizen students, right? That's their idea of the risking. And that's why now we're going to the exciting part. Some of these major developments in China are incredible and very much consequential. So we have been seeing the rise of China wars and China bans. Banning Chinese ByteDance, although Trump is trumping it. But this chip wars is something real, right? So NVIDIA, for instance, is banned from selling its most high-end Lamborghini-level semiconductors, the one that it can send across our, let's just say, another car without offending anyone in the house. But this is the thing. China is still a developing country. Its per capita is around just $12,000. Last time I checked, nominal purchasing power just around $30,000, even lower than Turkey. But it has the size and at the same time the technological edge that is really, so 2 years ago I was in Munich for the Munich Security Conference, and this was before the Ukraine invasion. Obviously, I remember vividly Zelensky there, really looking pathetic and weak back then. I had no idea he'll be what he became. I remember the Boris Johnson speech, everyone like standing room, amazing speaker, not amazing person. And then Kamala Harris, everyone's almost falling asleep, right? Anyway, it's not, no offense. It's nothing misogynist, just to be really, you can go there and, anyway. But the thing that really got my attention is when the gentleman who was driving me along and all, and a couple of Germans I talked, this is in Munich, right? Just next to the BMW museum. He said, we're actually scared that the Chinese will beat us in making better cars in the next 5 years or so. If the Germans tell you they're scared of Chinese when it comes to car, the one thing they're really good at, I mean, Germans are good in other things that I'd rather not talk about, like philosophy, of course, and great beer and all. But then you have to take the Chinese seriously, right? So if you look at China, they have been focusing on dominating the next generation or upcoming technologies. Whether it's EV, my goodness. Forget about the final BYD product. Practically every mine, cobalt, nickel, whatever, they have got it from Indonesia to Africa to Chile. They have completely dominated the supply chain. It's a 90% Chinese-dominated supply chain, EV, right? Artificial intelligence, we'll talk about DeepSeek very shortly, and then quantum communications, which allows them actually to circumvent American intelligence, espionage, satellite interventions whatsoever. So just to give you an idea how fast things are moving, just half a decade ago, the gentleman on the left, Elon Musk, well, and he was not very rich back then, but he was making fun. There are these videos of Elon Musk making fun of BYD cars, like, who on earth will buy a BYD car? And when he was asked about, do you think China will ever be a competition to you? What he didn't know is that even some of the Americans, including Warren Buffett, were actually paying more attention. Now, he's arguing, if we don't put tariffs on Chinese cars, we can't beat them, right? And the other day, the other day I was in a Tesla shop, and even the Tesla people there told me the finishing job of the Chinese EVs is nicer than Tesla. And I can say yes. Right? It's almost Italian, right? So if you look at it, BYD was already the warning that there was technological complacency in the West, that they will always be ahead of China because China is not cool, China is not free, and unfree countries supposedly cannot innovate. Well, guess what? China is doing it like crazy. And that's where industrial policy comes in. I'm a big believer in the entrepreneurship and hard work of the Chinese people, whether it's Chinoy or people from China, whether it's my grandmother whose grandparents came from Fujian to vegan back in the day. But what I also admire about China is their industrial policy, especially the Made in China 2025 project, which, by the way, they copied from the Germans. The Germans had a version of that. And they're doing it like crazy. This, for me, is the art of public policy innovation that very few people appreciate. To be honest, I'd rather have my students not go to Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'd rather have them go to Tsinghua or Beijing to learn more about public policy innovation. Because the things you're seeing in China are really next level. Now, I know some of our free market friends are not happy with Tencent or ByteDance being bullied by commissars, but I'd rather side with commissars than big tech companies if what we're seeing is happening right now. But let me tell you what, actually more than 10 years ago, before the US realized you cannot separate geoeconomics from geopolitics, the Chinese already had realized that. I call that the Snowden shock. You know Edward Snowden, right? So Edward Snowden, I think he's still in Russia and still alive. I don't know, last time I checked. Edward Snowden used to work in where Tulsi Gabbard will soon be the boss, right? Anyway, let's not throw shades too much at Trump people. But so Snowden actually exposed, and there are a couple of Wall Street Journal pieces. I think Wall Street Journal did the best pieces on that. No offense to New York Times and our friends there. Whereby he actually showed that the US was inside the system in China. Because of the Microsoft we're using, because of all the software using. You know what China did? We will make our own OS. Today, you go to a far-flung Chinese barangay, whatever version they have, the entire thing is Chinese OS. You buy a Huawei Mate right now, the OS is completely Chinese. Even the semiconductors, Huawei is making its own. So actually, when Trump imposed on ZTE and Huawei, it was already too late by then, because by 2014-15, China already had a whole-of-nation approach to build a parallel software universe to go with a parallel semiconductor universe. And then when Trump came in, he just gave them more reason, and they doubled down. And we are where we are, which is essentially, all of this cool stuff. DeepSeek, right? I love my Samsung, but this is like 3 level. And then like the BYD cars, you can buy that 7 million pesos. like entry-level Ferrari versus that one looks better, right? Anyway, so I don't know why people are so shocked with what DeepSeek was able to achieve. Even if, let's say, the $5 million was really not true, let's say $200 million, China's proven to us that you should never underestimate them, and that you should never be technologically complacent where you're up against China. And we also know there is a dark side to this story. There's also technological theft. And also there's natural revolving door phenomenon. A lot of engineers who work in Tesla Shanghai tomorrow are working in NIO, tomorrow are working in BYD. So, there's diffusion. But China's innovation and R&D should not be underestimated. Last year, China beat all countries on earth in terms of scientific production based on ISI high impact citation. Not mumbo jumbo plagiarist stuff. There's a lot of plagiarism in China, apparently, but they now have the biggest production. A mid-level Sichuan University just beat MIT in terms of scientific production this year. I'm not saying let's fold over and say Team China na tayo. What I'm saying is give credit where credit is due. And I'm sick and tired of the Western hubris of technological complacency. And let's start learning from China when it comes to industrial policy, not their maps and all, but industrial policy and all of that, right? Now, actually, if you bother to read some of the interesting stuff coming up, everyone reads this, why nations failed, and okay, good, they got the Nobel Prize or whatever, fake Nobel Prize economics guys get it. But actually, the whole Darren Acemoglu Robinson's argument doesn't make sense anymore, right? Their entire argument is that to be a successful country, you have to have inclusive institutions. Last time I checked, China is undemocratic. There's a very strong state intervention, and yet they beat the West on every single level. Poverty alleviation, they lifted 650 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years. I'll go on and on and on, but yeah, they don't have freedom and all, sure. But they beat the West in a lot of very important realms of power in innovation, which just puts into question some of the conventional assumptions of economics, right? Including institutional economics, right? Now, if you bother to read some of our good friends, for instance, Ha-Joon Chang's Kicking Away the Ladder, right? Which is a story of how South Korea became South Korea. You would know that actually a lot of countries who are technologically advanced today, they had to steal through it, they had to labor violation through it, they had to corrupt like hell through it. You know how corrupt Korea was in the 70s and 80s? It's still very corrupt, right? You saw, Park Geun-hye went down because her shaman was having Samsung. Yeah. But, you just Google Davos scandals. So essentially, Ha-Joon Chang's argument is that corruption and labor, these are part of the story of rising new powers building new global industries. In 1950s, Korea had zero shipbuilding capacity. Today, it's one of the top 2 or top 3 shipbuilding countries in the world. They created their own comparative advantage. It's all nonsense about focus on what you're good at. Okay, you have maraming tao, mag-export ka lang ng labor. Or you have a lot of technology, stick to it. That's nonsense. So that's what Ha-Joon Chang and a lot of these experts, the new one that I'm really into is our good friend Yuen Ang from SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. Her book, China's Gilded Age, talks about how China is a classic case of super high corruption and super high growth and super high technological innovation, which goes against conventional wisdom because she said, as Max Weber said more than 100 years ago, there are varieties of corruption. There's access corruption, there's grand theft corruption. So what am I saying is that we also have many simplistic ideas about development, good governance, etc., which doesn't help us understand why on earth is China so successful. And to just say because China steals technology kind of misses the point, although they do steal technology. But guess what? Everyone was doing that 100 years ago. The Germans were doing that. It's just the story of national development. I'll go to the last part of this, which is culture and politics. I'm already sweating. I don't know why, because it looks like an interrogation. Let's talk about soft power. Until recently, I was a big believer that if there's one area you cannot beat the West is in cultural attraction, right? So soft power is essentially Joseph Nye's right-wing version of what Antonio Gramsci would call hegemony, right? Because hegemony means you have influence over people not only because of force, but because of their consent. What Machiavelli would say, the perfect synthesis of deception and attraction, right? The fox part of power, not the lion part, right? I was a big believer that Hollywood and the West will dominate the cultural realm for decades to come, until I saw these Koreans just beating the heck out of the Americans right and left. You go on Netflix, nothing comes close to Squid Game, right? Look at the BTS phenomenon. Even Biden is, like, show me a single boy band from the West that goes anywhere close to what the Koreans are putting on. And my sense is, if you look at the Koreans, it's really kind of a knockoff of Hollywood, but actually at the same time adopted to kind of a culture, and then they have an Asian face and all of that. For me, that gives you an idea that coolness is very much democratized nowadays. So the idea of China cool, for me, is actually not impossible. And if ever China becomes cool, I think it will be the first ever cool communist country. Although personally, I'm more like Team Cuba. I think if you want the cool, sexy Latino one, like Cuba was always my favorite. But Vietnam is also getting there, which is a very similar system. If you look at the Doi Moi of Vietnam, it's a very similar system to what, essentially they're copying what Deng Xiaoping was suggesting 15, 20 years earlier, because Doi Moi was introduced, I think, late 1980s, 1990s, right? So, rise of Vietnam, rise of China, these ex-communist countries, etc., just shows you that fundamental assumptions about rise of nations, attraction, soft power, technological innovation have to be really revisited. But you see, what makes China cool, in quotation mark, is not only some of this fancy stuff they're putting up at half the price. I was looking at the iPad Pro, it's like 120K with the keyboard, and then look at the Huawei, it's like 50. If you buy this Chinese phone, you'll get even a free DJI drone. It's like, how are you gonna beat that? The only reason I don't buy it is because I don't want my phone to be hacked by China. They already hacked 3 of my other phones, and my TikTok is messed up. But if I were not a guy in politics, believe me, all my stuff would be Huawei probably now, right? And my car is probably BYD. But what makes China also cool is, man, it's hard to beat that. 20 years ago, I was in a Middle Eastern country, and I was very young. And I went to a station, a newly opened train station. And I saw a lot of like Chinese workers and engineers, and I was like, what's going on? And someone told me, actually, this is a Chinese project. So 20 years ago, I already saw China was building a global footprint of building big ticket infrastructure projects, right? In wealthy, oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, among other things, right? Today, some call Africa China's second continent. And China is beating the heck out of some of the international, I know we have friends from ADB and all, but it's like they're giving good competitions to some of our friends and all of that. Now, obviously, we can talk about debt trap and all of that, blah, blah, blah. Well, other side would say we can talk about the negative impact of structural adjustment programs. My problem was pledge trap. The worst thing you can do is to cut deals with China and then nothing comes in, like what happened with us a few years ago. But anyway, if you look at China, and the thing also with China is they give you literally white elephant projects. Look at the amazing African Union building given for free. Obviously, it's all Huawei top and all, but you get what I'm saying? Where are the Americans? Are Americans making anything along those lines? You go to Latin America, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Central Asia, the only Americans you see are Americans with boots and military and all of that. So that's the problem we're seeing right now. And the thing with China is that there's no distinction between the state and companies and all. It's an integrated system. I don't want to call it state capitalist. It's something completely different. It's a hybrid system. In the US, the government cannot force their companies to invest in your country. That's already a structural disadvantage they have. So how are you going to compete with that, right? The only way you can compete with that is that ADB and World Bank and whatever, they can't come together and kind of put some money together. But good luck. So this is what China brings to the table, a combination of hard infrastructure, super affordable, high-tech, and who knows, we'll be all Cantonese pop fans down the road. I mean, I saw some of their stuff, really cool stuff, right? Anyway, we're going towards the end of this discussion. The other big disruption we're seeing today, actually some of the disruption a while ago were kind of okay with me. I don't mind cheaper alternatives. But these are the more worrying part. There's a dark side also, the disruption. It's really the rise of populism, but a very different kind of populism, right? Populism basically means you are unconventional in terms of your language. Nagmumura ka, siguro or ganon. Populism means that you don't follow the main playbook of what a statesman should be like. So it's a style. So, but the version of populism we're seeing today is really a kind of a dark combination of demagoguery and disinformation, really working together, right? And some would also say toxic masculinity, because a lot of macho-ness is going along with this, right? And that's really worrying to me. In fact, if you look at the data here, for instance, on this side, we have been seeing a consistent decline of liberal and electoral democracies. If you look at the Freedom House, I personally contribute to Freedom House rankings and all, so I know how these things are compiled. You can look at the Journal of Democracy, among other things. So democracies have been in trouble already for more than a decade. In fact, in 2014, when I wrote that book about the rise of Duterte, binasa ba ni President? Buhay pa naman ako. Hindi na yata binasa yung book namin. I'm just kidding, Secretary. Putting it. Anyway, 2014, around 65% of Filipinos that were asked, are you willing to have a leader who dispenses with democratic institutions if he can deliver more services and all? Majority of Filipinos said yes. The same thing in almost every third wave democracy country. This is the World Value Survey. If you look at the, we had that in our previous discussion here, right? If you look at the other surveys like Gallup and some of the other interesting surveys, only 15% of Filipinos, 12% of Indonesians, and I think around 7 or 8% of Indians were fully invested in liberal democracy, institutional checks and balances. 8 out of 10 Filipinos were open to an autocratic system. That means something is going on here. You can say it's disinformation, you can say it's charisma, but you can also say it's because our institutions are failing. How many years did we promise to give high-value jobs to our people, right? I'm an older millennial. I remember during our time, we were expecting all sorts of decent, nice jobs. And then look at the cost of living right now. And I'm even more worried for the next generation, Gen Zs. It's so easy to win over people with fantastical campaign and disinformation because there's a lot of discontent. The fundamental problem in political analysis nowadays is it's only supply-side political analysis, meaning, what did they do with disinformation? How charismatic is it? But you're not looking at why people like these people to begin with. Why in 2014, when no one knew Duterte would run, not even Duterte knew he would run, right? Maybe people were already looking for someone like Duterte. If 85% of your Congress was co-opted by dynasties, are there friends here? In 2015, during Aquino's time, and I think this next one will put me more in trouble, according to the World Bank in 2011, 40 richest families took home 76% of newly created growth. My question always was, we should have had someone like Duterte even earlier. Do you get what I'm saying? Last point, I remember this is before the Russians made the all-out invasion of Ukraine. I was still talking to some Russian friends, and a Russian friend, a diplomat, came to me and said, Richard, what kind of democracy you have? He said, in my barangay, everyone's name is Reyes. They're all family. And then there's one guy who has a different name, that's apparently the son-in-law. He said, what kind of democracy is that? That's true, right? I mean, how can we? So I think our fundamental problem today, if you're liberal, Democrat, etc., is you're forced to defend institutions that are actually not working. You're forced to defend paradigms that are actually not working. So for me, and this is the last part really, if you want to move in a more, whatever you want to call it, liberal, progressive, you should stop defending the institution and you should propose how to make institutions work. Whether it's industrial policy, whether it's representation, whether it's balance of power and deterrence, or technological innovation. So that's why, these are my conclusions. First of all, we need really a fundamental rethink of some of our foundational assumptions about national development, power, and what really works. So we have to have humility. I look forward to this presentation in 2 years probably. I'll be happy if this one evolves. That means I'm open to changing my ideas. I'm always worried when I see some gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, I see them in 20 years, they have the same PowerPoint. They just changed the opening line. Like, dude, like, 20 years ago, China was like, you know, everyone had bicycles there. Like, in India naman. Medyo, do you get what I'm saying? 20 years ago, everyone had motorbikes in Vietnam. Like, it's a completely different world, right? Second, we fundamentally have a fragility of existing democracies. And my goodness, rules-based international order. The rules-based international order is like the joke about the Austrian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Neither holy no Roman because they were German, Austrian, and not really an empire because it was really a bunch of stateless. So that's my rules-based international order. Not very rulesy, not very orderly, and not very international because you have like each superpower carving out their own sphere of influence, right? And lastly, yes, the rise of far right, in my opinion, is really a reflection of failure of the progressive left, but also the collapse of the liberal center. It's a reality in practically every major democracy in the world, with the exception of India, Indonesia, and Philippines, I would say. No, actually, in Philippines, I hope I'll still be invited. No, I think President Marcos Jr. represents the political center. This is the most center we can have. But let's see, I don't want to say more on that. But in every major democracy, see, France, Germany, yesterday I saw the latest polling, the UKIP guys, Nihal Farage people, are number one already. They're like 27%. Like, we got a problem, right? And I don't know about Democrats if they're gonna. So this is the reality we're seeing all around the world. So the center is collapsing, and that's always a warning sign. So you're seeing, and that's why I mentioned Adam Tooze, because Adam Tooze is the guy who popularized, he didn't coin it. Usually the French are the guys who come with fancy terms. The term polycrisis. My term will be polydisruption. You're having a simultaneous disruption on every single front at the same time. Parang yung movie na everywhere. Exactly. That's our thing, right? So on that note, thank you very much for that entertaining conversation. I feel I'm giving a stand-up comedy with all of these slides. But do you get what I'm saying? Exciting times. One last thing. I want to quote, since Zhou Enlai he had a conversation. Let me end with Kissinger again. He had a conversation with Kissinger, and Kissinger talked about the French Revolution and the evolution of history and all of that. And Zhou Enlai, being very sleazy and very charming, and said, it's too early to say if the French Revolution succeeded, right? So it's too early to say, like who's gonna win the 21st century. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat. Jeez, what was that?